President, it's amazing how much we talk about our kids. People talk about bipartisan things here all the time. Well, there's a bipartisan conversation often about our families and about our kids, about how proud of them that we are, about sharing our lives with each other. Our kids and my two daughters, they're a remarkable part of my family, who I am. And I can't even process life without thinking about the two of them. Our kids are some of the most valuable moments of our entire life and our greatest memories. When they were little, we looked into their eyes, we saw potential, and we dreamed for them. From our earliest days of pregnancy, Cindy and I talked about the future for our girls. As we prayed for them, thought about them, prepared for them, and it sunk in what the incredible responsibility that they really are. Kids are that way. This is that earliest moment that we talk about all the time. What's remarkable about this photo is thinking about just exactly what this moment could be like. Because in this moment, there's really two directions that it could go in America, because this little one was born several weeks early. For that little one, life could have gone two different directions. This group of doctors is gathered around this little one, delivering this child and watching them take their very first breath. But only seconds before that, that same little one we see there, in this same group of doctors, could have destroyed that life in the womb, and it would have been okay. You see, in America, this moment could go two different directions at any time. This life could be there, and we could watch the decades ahead of them, or seconds before this picture was taken, when that child was still in the womb, that life could have been destroyed, and no one would have paid attention. Because the determination whether this is a child or whether this is just a little lump of tissue is determined by a few seconds in a delivery room. It's still inside the womb, it's not a child. It's just tissue. A few seconds later, when it's delivered, everyone smiles and looks at the face of this baby and says, what a beautiful child and what a remarkable miracle that is. How do we do that in America? How do we try to decide what's life and what's just tissue? Some people would say it's only a child if we believe that it's a child. If we don't believe it's a child, it's not a child, it's only tissue. If some people would say it has incredible value and we should prepare for his or her college and we should think and pray about their future and their spouse and what they're going to do. And some people would say it's meaningless, just flesh that can literally be put into a bag and taken to the curb. The determination's really the mom and the dad there. They get to choose whether that's a child or whether that's tissue. I honestly don't understand that conversation. Because when I look at this child with fingers and toes and hair and unique DNA, there's nothing different about that child right there than this child. You see, that child that we saw in the picture before is the same age as this. But this time, this is a 3D ultrasound taken inside the womb. But there's no difference between the two. Both of them have a face and fingers and toes and a nervous system, a functioning brain. They have lungs. They have DNA that is different than the mom, different than the dad. DNA that is unique to that person. Whether you can see them or not, that heartbeat and that DNA is a child. In America, we still have this ongoing dialogue. When is life life? I heard someone jokingly say earlier that if this life was discovered on Mars, we would say Mars has life on it. But we're still discussing whether this life is a life on Earth. What do we do with that? Well, here's what we continue to debate and continue to have a conversation. January the 22nd, 1973, the Supreme Court ruled on a ruling that is now the infamous Roe v. Wade decision. It was supposed to have settled the issue about life. It was supposed to settle the issue that every single state has to allow abortion, and that life, according to the Supreme Court in 1973, was about viability. When can this child live on their own outside the womb? Viability. Well, viability in 1973 is very different than viability now, thankfully. When we think about viability now, there are children born at 21, 22 weeks, extremely early, that would have never survived in 1973, that regularly survive now because of great medical care. Viability really doesn't determine life, though. Life is something that begins much earlier. And for some reason in our culture, we're still having a conversation about what to do with that tissue. We as Americans spend a lot of time trying to be able to work on very difficult issues, but for some reason this has become a partisan issue that's exceptionally divisive in our culture. This life and this child shouldn't be a partisan issue. It shouldn't be a Republican child or a Democrat child. This should just be a child. And we should be able to pause for a moment and be able to determine, what are we going to do about her? And is she valuable? We spend billions of dollars as a culture caring for the homeless because we believe that every single life matters. And no life can just be thrown away just because they struggle with life. We spend billions of dollars caring for the oldest and the weakest in our society because they need 24-hour care, and we respect that life and the dignity that they carry. We demand equal protection for women and men, all races, all ages, all sexual orientations, all faiths. We demand that as a culture because we believe as a culture that every person should have respect and every person should have opportunity because of their great potential. We pat ourselves on the back when we adopt abused animals, when we stand up against human trafficking worldwide, when we help clean up ocean trash, or we plant trees to beautify our community. But we're having a tough time considering that child is a child. We even require that cigarettes, alcohol, theme park rides, medicines, and many other products have warning labels on them to warn pregnant moms not to use this product because it could harm that child. Because as a culture, we acknowledge that a mom smoking hurts a child, but for some reason, we can't seem to acknowledge that that child could be hurt by an abortion, and it really ends a life. It is my guess that anyone who disagrees with this has already tuned me out. Because as a culture, we don't want to think about this life. Because if for a moment we pause and consider that maybe she's really alive and has purpose and value, we would have to swallow hard and acknowledge the millions of little girls just like her that have died in abortions in America. Millions. And so to fight against having to deal with that, we just don't want to think about it, and we just tune it out. But if you're one of the folks that's actually stuck with me in this dialogue, let me walk through a couple of things, just for us to think about. Let's start with a few things. The science. This little girl has DNA that's different than mom or dad, has cell division, has something that we would look at in normal embryonic development called the Carnegie stages of development. For years and years, every medical school teaches the Carnegie stages of development, looking at cell division at the beginning point, and acknowledges as they go through the process, this is a child from the earliest moments, and that is a stage of life. Every single person that can hear me right now has gone through the Carnegie stages of embryonic development just like this little one has. Every person has, because we understand that is a natural part of life. That is a stage of life. It's an acknowledgement of life. It's something that we acknowledge in the animal world because this Congress has passed laws to deal with endangered species, including a $100,000 fine if you damage a golden eagle egg, a bald eagle egg, if you go to marine turtles to their nesting spot and destroy or even disturb the nest of a marine turtle. Or in Oklahoma, what we deal with barn swallows that will build their nest in the springtime in a construction area. All construction has to stop if a barn swallow builds a nest in your construction area, because those eggs are important, not because so much of the barn swallow, but because there's common understanding in this Congress that those eagle eggs, turtle eggs, barn swallow eggs is a future barn swallow, turtle, and eagle. We acknowledge that's a life that's in process, and so we protect it. But we can't seem to make the just simple logical step that eagle egg becomes an eagle and she is a little girl. The science screams at us in this area. But for many people, they just don't want to think about it. Because at this stage, she's in the womb. She's invisible. She hasn't reached this stage when you can see her. And so for many people, they only say, only alive when I can see her. If I can't see her, you're not real. Problem is, the science doesn't prove that out. Second issue that we've got to deal with is just where we are as a culture and as we are as a country compared to other countries on this simple issue about looking at this little one and saying, is that a child or is that just tissue? Where the rest of the world on this? Well, it's interesting to note on it. The rest of the world's in a very different spot than the United States on this. This is just a simple map of the world. Most of the world, and you'll see it in the gray here, most of the world says that abortion should stop at 12 weeks. That's 3 months. After 3 months, you can't have an abortion anymore. There are 7 countries in the world that will allow abortion all the way up to 24 weeks. They're the countries that are here in black: Canada, United States, China, North Korea, Vietnam, Singapore, and the Netherlands. They allow abortions to 24 weeks. But at 24 weeks and on, in that third trimester, there's only 4 countries in the world that allow late-term abortions. Only 4. China, North Korea, Vietnam, and the United States. Everywhere else in the world looks at that child and says that child is a child, fully viable, except the United States, China, North Korea, and Vietnam. Now, that's not a club I really want us to be in. All of Europe has banned late-term abortion, all of it. All of Africa, most of Asia, all of Central and South America. They've looked at this, and as a culture, they've said late-term abortions, no. That's a fully viable child. Interestingly enough, there's a survey that just came out today that was a nationwide survey asking Americans' opinion on this issue about life. 75% of Americans said there should not be abortion after 12 weeks, that's 3 months of pregnancy, except to protect the life of the mom. 75% of Americans. They're with this part of the world. This part of the world all says that same thing. That's most of Europe, and most of that area says, okay, 12 weeks, after 12 weeks, you got to stop. Because that child has a functioning nervous system and brain, and they're developing in all those areas. And even if you don't acknowledge where I am, where I believe life begins at conception, why can't you at least acknowledge at 12 weeks where most of the rest of the world is? To say that's a child that should be protected. At what point do we as Americans slow down enough to be able to look at what we don't want to look at, what the rest of the world has done, except for Vietnam, North Korea, and China? Why do we want to be in that group when we deal with the issue of life? Those are some of the worst human rights violators in the world. Why are we in that club? I've had folks that have recently said to me, you know, I understand this is a legislative issue, but it's really a faith issue. This is really about your faith, and your faith shouldn't legislate who I am. Well, I would only tell you that cultures all make decisions, including our cultures, not just about their faith, but their values as a culture. Stealing is also a religious issue. It's in the 10 Commandments. So maybe as a culture, we shouldn't ban stealing because the 10 Commandments says you shouldn't steal. But no one would really say that because as a culture, we all look at it and say theft is a problem. You shouldn't be able to do that. Cultures make decisions based out of their own personal values. So it's not just a religious issue, but our faith does impact our personal lives and decisions. And it does affect who we are. In China, where most faith is banned, they allow abortion at any stage. In fact, in China, the state is the most important thing. Everything is about building up the state. The individual has no value. The state has the greatest value. And so in China, they determine we have too many people, and so they force women to have abortions and compel them. Some can only have one child, some can have 2 children, but every child after that has to be aborted because the state chooses that, because their greatest value is the state. Our greatest value is the individual. That's why our documents begin with things like, we the people, because the individual has value. We look at the senior adults in the nursing home and provide care for them, the homeless person, the child who's in need of food, and that little girl is still in the womb, and say they all have value because the individual has importance. I had someone that caught me and said, you know, your faith has this whole verse in it where it says, I was knit together in my mother's womb. And so this is a religious issue. You have belief that each child was knit together by God in their mother's womb. And then they paused to me and said, that's fine for you to have that belief, but I have the belief that they were knit together, but it's when they're not done, they're not fully knit together, they're not really a shirt, they're only a sleeve. And if they're still being in development, then they're not fully developed, they're not really a child yet. And I smile at that and say, actually this child, though this one was born premature, you're right, is not fully developed. It's not just a sleeve, it's just a smaller shirt. But she'll get there. Because everything about your life's development, your hair color, your height, your health, is all bound up in those first cells as they start dividing in your own unique DNA. This is not about a religious conviction. This is about a child and who we are as a culture. Now, let me say this. I understand there's a lot of conversation. As I mentioned before, this becomes a partisan, divisive issue. This is not trying to be Republican-Democrats. I've met Republicans and Democrats that both can look at this picture and say that's a child, not tissue. This shouldn't be a divisive political issue. Neither this should be an attacking, condemning issue to moms and dads who have walked through abortion. I have great compassion for them, quite frankly. Those moms that have had abortion, that memory never goes away for them. Years later, they sit in the food court at the mall and watch a small child playing nearby and think that's how old my child would be right now if they were still alive. I've not met a mom ever that wasn't affected by abortion and the memories that come back to them on that. This is not a flippant issue for any person that goes through an abortion. I grieve for those folks and the struggle that they have. But I also grieve for us as a nation in the devaluing of something so obvious as a child. We can do better as a country, but the first thing we have to do is stop and look. As a nation, we've been through some moments that we are not proud of, but we are proud as a nation of who we can become. We're not proud as a nation that at one point we declared African American men and women as 3/5 of a man. We are not proud of that as a nation. We are not proud as a nation that we once told women they could not vote. We are not proud as America that at one point we took Japanese Americans and interned them in camps because we were afraid of them. We're not proud of those moments as America. And I pray there is a day that we're not proud that we looked away from little girls and little boys and said, you're not human enough yet. Your life can be ended because I don't want to look at you. The beginning for us really is to stop and look at what's obvious. That's a child. What are you going to do about that child? One of the great books of the 20th century was written by a man named Ralph Ellison, who, by the way, was an Oklahoman. Ralph Ellison was a tremendous African-American author, and he wrote in the early 20th century a book called Invisible Man. It's a remarkable journey to be able to look into that time period But the author, who is really writing as the narrator in the book, the narrator is telling his story. In the prologue of the book, there's a section that I want to be able to read to you because I think it's powerful just in thinking about the philosophy that Ralph Ellison put out. He said this: I'm a man of substance, of flesh and bone, fiber and liquids, and I might even be said to possess a mind, but I am invisible. I'm invisible, understand, simply because people refuse to see me. Like the bodiless heads you sometimes see at circus sideshows, it's as though I've been surrounded by mirrors of hard, distorting glass. When they approach me, they only see my surroundings, themselves, or figments of their imagination. Indeed, everything and anything except me. Nor is my invisibility exactly a matter of biochemical accident to my epidermis. That invisibility to which I refer occurs because of a particular disposition of the eyes of those with whom I come into contact. A matter of the construction of the inner eyes, those eyes with which they look through their physical eyes upon reality. Ralph Ellison was saying, white America in the early 20th century ran into black America but refused to look and ignored as if they were invisible and just walked on. As a culture, I'm grateful that Americans are opening their eyes to each other as friends and as neighbors and as Americans. And I wonder one day when the peculiar eyes that choose to pretend this child is invisible simply because she looks like this, when our peculiar eyes will choose to look at what we've chosen to say is invisible and to turn away and to say, let's see what we do as a culture to make this right. Let's march for life. Let's speak out for what's obvious. And let's determine what to do in the next step. With that, I yield the floor.